One tiny mistake that exposed the most infamous bank heist in history. Before we begin, remember to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments what you think really happened in this case, because the truth behind this story shocked investigators around the world. The streets of London were still quiet in the early hours of April 12, 2015. It was Easter weekend, and most businesses in the Hatton Garden district had closed their doors for the long holiday. Normally, the area was buzzing with life, jewelers negotiating deals, couriers moving precious stones, and security guards keeping watch over millions of dollars worth of valuables. But that night, something was terribly wrong. Inside a building on Hatton Garden, an alarm system had triggered hours earlier. At first, it seemed like a minor technical glitch. Alarms in buildings like this occasionally malfunctioned, and the company responsible for monitoring the system made a quick phone call to check on it. No one answered. By the time a security officer finally arrived to inspect the building, the alarm had already stopped. The streets were silent. Everything looked normal from the outside. But deep below the building, hidden behind thick concrete walls and layers of steel, something unbelievable had already happened. A group of men, not young criminals or reckless thrill-seekers, but experienced aging thieves in their 60s and 70s, had just carried out one of the most daring burglaries in modern British history. They had broken into the Hatton Garden safe deposit vault. And they had done it with precision. Using heavy drilling equipment, they had cut through a reinforced concrete wall nearly half a meter thick. The noise should have been deafening, but the thieves had carefully planned their timing during the quiet holiday weekend. Inside the vault were hundreds of safe deposit boxes belonging to jewelers, wealthy collectors, and businesses. Some boxes contained diamonds. Others held cash, rare jewelry, or family heirlooms worth generations of wealth. Over the course of hours, the thieves methodically broke open dozens of boxes. Bag after bag was filled with glittering valuables. By the time they left the vault, they had stolen an estimated £14 million worth of jewels, gold, and cash. It was the largest burglary in British history. But at that moment, no one knew. 3 days later, when business owners returned after the Easter holiday, the truth began to unravel. One jeweler walked into the building and noticed something strange. The elevator leading down to the vault wasn't working properly. Another tenant tried to access their deposit box but found the vault door jammed. Security staff were called. When they finally managed to open the vault room, the scene inside looked like something from a crime movie. Hundreds of metal boxes had been ripped open. The floor was covered with broken locks and empty containers. Owners of the boxes began arriving one by one, and the reactions were heartbreaking. Some people realized their entire life savings were gone. Others had lost family jewelry that could never be replaced. Within hours, the police had sealed off the entire street. Detectives from Scotland Yard's Flying Squad, the elite unit specializing in armed robbery and serious theft, were called in to investigate. At first, the scale of the crime left them stunned. This wasn't a smash-and-grab robbery. This was something far more calculated. The thieves had disabled security systems, studied the building's layout, and used industrial tools to drill through the vault wall. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. But there was something even more strange. When investigators reviewed early evidence, they realized the suspects might not be the kind of criminals they expected. Security cameras from nearby streets showed blurry figures moving equipment late at night. But their movements were slow, deliberate, almost careful. These weren't young men rushing through the job. They moved like people who had done this many times before. Veteran detectives began to suspect something unusual. This heist might have been carried out by old-school career criminals, men who had spent decades perfecting their craft. And then investigators discovered the first critical clue. A piece of surveillance footage from inside the building's elevator shaft showed one of the thieves struggling to move a heavy bag of stolen valuables. As he lifted it, something slipped from his pocket. At first, it looked insignificant. But when detectives zoomed in on the footage, they realized it might be the tiny mistake that would expose the entire crew. And when they traced that clue back to its owner, they uncovered something shocking. The man linked to the evidence wasn't just any thief. He was one of the most notorious career criminals in Britain. And this heist had only just begun to unravel. The tiny object that slipped from the thief's pocket didn't look like much at first. When investigators enhanced the footage, they realized it was a small piece of debris, something that had fallen from the man's clothing as he struggled with the heavy bag. Detectives at Scotland Yard knew that even the smallest detail could break open a case like this. And in a crime this big, someone was bound to make a mistake. Forensic teams carefully searched the vault and surrounding areas. Every tool mark, every footprint, every speck of dust was documented. The hole drilled through the vault wall told its own story. It had been cut with professional-grade equipment, the kind used on construction sites. These weren't amateurs. But then investigators noticed something interesting about the way the thieves had entered the building. They hadn't smashed their way inside. Instead, they had used a lift shaft to climb down into the basement level. It was clever, but also risky. Security cameras inside the elevator shaft had captured partial footage of the suspects during the burglary. The images weren't clear enough to identify faces, but the detectives could see their movements. Slow, deliberate, and surprisingly careful. One officer studying the footage made an observation that changed the entire direction of the investigation. These men, they're old. At first, that sounded ridiculous. The idea that elderly criminals had just pulled off the largest burglary in British history seemed almost impossible. But the more they analyzed the footage, the clearer it became. The men moved cautiously. One appeared to struggle slightly with the ladder in the shaft. Another paused frequently as if catching his breath. These were not young thieves. This was a crew of veteran criminals. And that realization triggered something in the minds of the detectives from the flying squad. For decades, London had been home to a network of professional burglars who specialized in high-end heists. Many of them had spent years in prison during the 1970s and 1980s for robbing banks, jewelry stores, and security vaults. But by 2015, most of those men were considered retired. Or so everyone thought. Detectives began digging through old criminal records, looking for names connected to sophisticated burglaries. One name kept appearing again and again. Brian Reeder. Reeder wasn't just any criminal. He had been involved in major robberies dating back decades. In fact, he had once been connected to the famous Brinksmat gold bullion robbery in 1983, one of Britain's most notorious heists. By the time the Hatton Garden robbery happened, Reeder was in his 70s. But age didn't mean he had lost his skills. Investigators began quietly placing him under surveillance. What they saw confirmed their suspicions. Reeder wasn't acting like a retired man enjoying quiet days at home. Instead, he was meeting with a group of other elderly men at cafes, pubs, and parking lots across London. The meetings looked casual at first, but detectives noticed something strange. The same group kept appearing together. Danny Jones, Terry Perkins, Carl Wood, John Collins. All of them had long criminal histories. And all of them were old-school burglars. It was starting to look like the impossible had happened. A gang of elderly career criminals had come out of retirement to pull off the most daring vault burglary in British history. But investigators still needed proof. Then the surveillance team recorded something that stunned everyone involved in the case. Hidden microphones picked up conversations between the suspects during one of their meetings. Instead of lying low after the robbery, the men were openly discussing the heist. They complained about the heavy drilling equipment. They argued about how the loot should be divided. One of them even joked about their age. Next time, one voice said with a laugh, "We bring younger legs." For detectives listening to the recordings, it was both shocking and surreal. The suspects were practically confessing. But there was still one problem. The stolen jewels and cash, worth nearly £14 million, had completely vanished. The gang had hidden the loot somewhere in London. And without recovering the stolen valuables, the case wouldn't be complete. So police prepared a series of coordinated arrests. But just before the operation could begin, something unexpected happened. One of the gang members suddenly disappeared. And when detectives searched his home, they discovered a locked container hidden in the garage. Inside were bags filled with glittering diamonds, gold jewelry, and stacks of cash. But the amount recovered was only a fraction of what had been stolen, which meant one terrifying possibility. Someone in the gang had secretly taken a larger share. And they were about to vanish forever with millions. The discovery in the garage confirmed what detectives had already begun to suspect. The gang that carried out the Hatton Garden heist had started to turn on itself. Inside the locked container were bags packed with diamonds, gold chains, antique jewelry, and bundles of cash. It glittered under the harsh white light of the police evidence room, a silent reminder of the fortune that had vanished from the vault. But something didn't add up. The recovered valuables were worth only a small portion of the estimated £14 million stolen from the safe deposit boxes, which meant most of the loot was still missing. And someone in the gang knew exactly where it was. By early May 2015, Scotland Yard had gathered enough evidence to move forward. Surveillance recordings, phone records, and the suspect's own conversations had painted a clear picture of the elderly crew behind the burglary. At the center of it all was Brian Reeder, the veteran criminal who had spent decades perfecting the art of burglary. The police operation was carefully planned. At dawn, Officers from the flying squad launched coordinated raids across London. Doors were forced open. Houses were searched. Suspects were taken into custody before they even had time to react. One by one, the members of the gang were arrested. Danny Jones, Terry Perkins, Carl Wood, John Collins, Brian Reeder. For the public, the arrests were shocking. The men who had carried out Britain's most infamous vault burglary weren't young masterminds or high-tech hackers. They were pensioners. Some were in their 70s. One used a walking stick. But behind their age was a lifetime of criminal experience. These men had spent decades studying alarms, locks, and security systems. They had learned patience, discipline, and above all, how to disappear after a job. Or at least they thought they had. Because the truth was now impossible to hide. During interrogation, the gang members began blaming each other. Arguments that had started after the robbery now erupted again inside police interview rooms. Some claimed others had taken a larger share of the jewels. Others insisted they had been cheated. But detectives already knew the real story. The tiny mistake that exposed the entire operation wasn't just one moment captured on camera. It was something much simpler. After the heist, several members of the gang couldn't resist celebrating. They met frequently. They talked openly about the robbery. They even joked about it in conversations that were quietly recorded by police surveillance teams. Years of criminal experience had taught them how to break into a vault. But it hadn't taught them how to stay silent afterward. When the case finally went to court in 2016, the evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the surveillance footage, the stolen jewels recovered from homes and garages. The gang members eventually pleaded guilty or were found guilty of conspiracy to commit burglary. For many of them, it would be the last prison sentence of their lives. Terry Perkins, one of the central figures in the heist, died in prison in 2018. Others spent their remaining years behind bars. But even after the convictions, one mystery remained unsolved. A large portion of the stolen jewels was never recovered. Some investigators believe those missing valuables were quietly sold on the black market. Others suspect a member of the gang secretly hid them before the arrests. If that's true, millions of dollars worth of diamonds could still be hidden somewhere in London, waiting to be discovered. The Hatton Garden burglary became a legend, not just because of the daring break-in, but because of the criminals who carried it out. A group of aging thieves who believed their experience made them untouchable. But in the end, it wasn't advanced technology or a brilliant detective that exposed them. It was a simple truth that has ended countless criminal schemes throughout history. No matter how perfect the plan seems, someone always makes a mistake. And sometimes, that mistake is all it takes to bring down the most infamous heist in history. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. So make sure you subscribe and stay tuned.